All right, let's talk about some chemical bonds. What they are, why are they important, where do we see them, and what are the different types? All right. So when we go to the fundamentals of any kind of element, the most important thing is this term called octet. What does octet mean? So octo is referring to 8, and every element is striving to be stable. And to be stable it needs to acquire this octet. Octet is referring to the valence electrons. Valence electrons are the electrons that are on the outermost regions, and they need to be in 8 total electrons to fill up their octet, right? So the standard elements that are basically considered inert, right, are the noble gases. The reason why they're called the noble gases is because they fill out their octet. Every other element requires either some kind of transfer or some kind of sharing of these electrons in order to fill and generate this octet. Okay? So when we look at the different types of elements that are present, we refer to them as either metals or nonmetals, right? And so you learned this from before, what the difference is. So metal is basically has a metallic structure, and nonmetal is exactly self-explanatory. How do you distinguish between the two? Well, I'm pretty sure you learned about the ladder, right? So the ladder that separates, it's in between the boron and the aluminum, and you draw a nice little ladder that comes all the way down. Everything on the left side is what? On the left side of that ladder is the metal, and everything on the right side is considered a non-metal. The only exception to the left side is hydrogen. Hydrogen is also as a gas, which is considered a non-metal. So the different types of bonds, so the first that we'll talk about are considered the covalent, and also we have the ionic. So the difference between the two is covalent is the sharing of electrons. So they share these things, these valence electrons. Whereas the ionic, they transfer their electrons. So their electrons are being transferred. Right, so either there is some kind of acceptor or some kind of donator of electrons. Another difference between the two is the type of elements. The covalent are a combination, a sharing electrons of nonmetal plus another nonmetal. Whereas the ionic is a nonmetal metal bond, okay, between the two here. All right, those are the two significant differences between the two. All right, so you have the ionic, which is the transfer of electrons. So an example of an ionic bond would be what? What's a standard that everyone uses? So let's use, for example, salt, table salt, sodium chloride. Right, so chlorine is a non-metal and sodium is a metal. Right, so this combination is this transfer is considered an ionic bond. Another reason why they're called ionic is when they combine. So like right now, if we have this in this solid neutral form, when they're combined in water, they can dissociate and they can ionize, right? So you have a sodium here that has a positive charge. We call that a cation. We can put a little substitutes here. And the chlorine, which has a negative charge, we call that an anion, right? So they have a potential to be ionized, so they have the ability to become a cation and an ion, right? So these are charged molecules. Example of a covalent bond, right? So when we actually go into further about these different types of bonds, there's two types of covalent bonds here. So there's two types. We're going to call them nonpolar, and then we call the other one polar covalent bonds. These are the two different types. Now, how are they different? What does polar mean? Polar means is their ability to generate some kind of dipole. What is a dipole? Dipole is an unequal distribution of charge of their electrons, okay? So an example of a polar molecule that you've heard about before is water. Water is an example of a polar molecule. Non-polar molecule can be the gases, like for example, oxygen, nitrogen, chlorine gas, right? So these are all some examples of these. Another term that you'll see a lot that I want you to all understand is if you ever see the word nonpolar, another name for that would be hydrophobic. So anything that is hydrophobic phobic. What does phobic mean? Phobic means hate or scared of. Vice versa, polar is also hydrophilic. So these words are used interchangeably. They mean the same thing here. So for example, an example of nonpolar we said was like the gases, right? So if I were to put, let's put it here. So oxygen, right? So that would be an example of a nonpolar molecule because there is an equal distribution of charge. Polar, as I said, has a dipole, so there's an unequal distribution of charge. Perfect example of that would be water. Okay, so these are some different types of bonds that you'll see. So there's 3 specific bonds that I actually talked about, 2 subgroups, and within one of the subgroups you have the 2 different other types of bonds. Okay, so it's really important to distinguish between the 2 because the different types of molecular chemistry that you'll see in the human body will be a comparison of these types of bonds that's presented for you here.